Xennials started when I reflected on how nihilistic and defeatist many Gen Xers appeared to be. But at the same time, I couldn't quite see myself in how idealistic many millennials came across. During my research, I stumbled across a great article on this micro-generation Xennials, with a contributor who's a psychologist and a Xennial himself, and understands this feeling of not really fitting anywhere. I'm Charlotte Kahn, an inquisitive Xennial, and in this episode, I'm talking to Michael Alcee, a psychologist based in New York. Welcome to Xennials. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Charlotte. Good to see you.
And thank you so much for joining us. Now, Michael, what's your own definition of a Xennial?
Yeah, and in America we call it an Xennial, but I love Xennial. So it's we as Xennials have this interesting blend between the analog world and the digital world, and we always are synthesizing them together. I love the intro clip of the MTV because we're the MTV generation, starting something new, but also recalling the past. You saw the rocket launch, which is sort of the analog, and the digital revolution beginning.
Michael, as a psychologist, have you noticed or do you feel that there are differences between generations?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about, like we've talked about Xennials, is that they're really savvy at using the technology, but also really emotionally intelligent with all the best of the analog world. And each generation has its own secret sauce. It has its own strength, but it also has its own limitations.
And psychologically, how are we faring? Or how different are we to different generations? Are we more prone to certain ailments or diseases? How would you describe it?
It's funny. I think one of the things that's been fascinating psychologically for the generations is that generations are changing quicker because technology changes quicker. So you're having these like sort of micro generations as well. And so I think that it muddies the waters in trying to figure out what generation is experiencing this versus that. But overall, I think while we see a lot of the progress of each generation, and also I think the dialogue and interplay between generations. I mean, you see this in the workplace. You see, Gen Xers and Xennials and millennials and boomers bringing a lot of different pieces to the table. And I think that makes a huge difference. And I think it's how we appreciate that sort of diversity of generations that's really, really helpful.
Michael, at the moment, we talk a lot about this mental health epidemic affecting Generation Z in particular. But if you think of Xennials or even slightly older Gen Xers, for instance, they were quite prone to problems as well, like depression, substance abuse, addictions, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in a way we become a victim of our own success. I think one of the things that the Xennial generation brings in, I think if you think about Oprah Winfrey, for example, and the kind of like prevalence of self-help books and the openness towards psychotherapy, that I think you have an emotional intelligence. I think you have more openness to these things, which also means that we notice a lot more and self-diagnose, and sometimes even too much. But I do think that there's something really interesting about our culture has gotten much more self-conscious, but it's also gotten much more self-aware.
Do you think that Xennials are maybe the first generation when it became okay to be more vulnerable? You mentioned Oprah, for instance, but if I think of the leaders, the Xennial leaders in power today, like Macron, Zelensky, etc., I have the impression that they are more open to share their struggles.
I think that's
Do you?
right on the money. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think if you look at Ardern, for example, in New Zealand, her showing up in her sweats to console her country and help them get through the lockdown, her also declaring that the tooth fairy was an essential worker for children. There's a real down-to-earth, emotionally intelligent quality to that that's very different. And we see it with Zelensky, too, showing up for his people, but also coming on different going throughout the world to be on media, but in a very kind of personal and intimate way. I think there's something that's really grown, and I think Xennials have ushered that in. And I think Oprah really is a big part of that too, because I think she made it really okay and good to explore these things, both in the nonfiction world and in the fictional world. And so I think as a culture, we've become much more emotionally available and, like you said, more vulnerable. In fact, when Ardern stepped down as prime minister, she said, I'm doing this because I am aware that I need to spend time with my family and I'm sensitive, but I also wanted to show people that sensitive people can be great leaders.
Michael, I have mentioned in previous podcasts that Generation X, so our older cohort, really, if we are to be mixed up in the same demographic group, tend to be more affected by suicide, unfortunately, as well as addiction, etc. But to me, Xennials, because they're a cross between Generation X and Millennials, are a bit more upbeat. Have you felt that throughout your research, maybe, or through your contact with patients?
Yeah, I think Gen X had a little bit more of the cynicism and the disillusionment that moved away, that shifted with the Xennials. And I think also Xennials saw some of the possibilities to bring these things together more. And I think sometimes the Gen X still has maybe a little bit of that boomer sense of not being able to have as much hope, right? They sort of fought authority and found it was lacking, right? So I do see that difference there between Gen Xers. And, the funny thing, like, as we talk about these generations, what's interesting is how much I think these generations impact each other so that individuals take on these characteristics, so that the generational thing isn't the only factor.
And what do you think were the most significant or even maybe even traumatic events for Xennials? Because in a previous podcast, I have described the 1990s, the decade where we came of age, as a decade that starts well with the fall of the Berlin Wall, lots of hopes, and it ends rather badly. In fact, it ends where you're based right now in New York with the 9/11 attacks. So they were very significant, defining moments for our generation.
Yeah, it's interesting because we saw the end of the Cold War and we saw this beginning of this war on terror. And you're right. I think there's so much that shifts. But I think actually one of the things that I think is actually rather hopeful that Xennials bring to the table is their comfort and openness to change and not being scared of that and actually figuring out how to make something interesting out of that and trying to use how you can connect deeply emotionally to people, but also how you can use technology to make that better. And so I think, Xennials are actually not too bothered by the fact that there would be such a dramatic shift to the Cold War, to the war on terror, to whatever we're in now, because we're used to being able to have to deal with the past and the future at the same time.
And that's possibly why we seem to be more resilient than subsequent generations, like Generation Z, I guess. So this mix of positive characteristics that you've mentioned, the fact that Xennials are emotionally intelligent, they are ambidextrous, etc. In light of those qualities, what can Xennials bring to the world?
Yeah, I think, you said it really well there, that the Xennials also realize we can dig into these things with all of the best of what the analog world brought, which was the analog world brought us the capacity to slow down, to reflect and really process and not get so distracted that we forget about what's really important, what values are really important. But the digital world helped us figure out how to do that more productively and efficiently, and even connect across countries, across different groups, and to really partake of this wonderful diversity that we have. And so I think something that Xennials show is a new way of being integrated psychologically, and also new ways of putting leadership forward.
Well, that's a very upbeat and positive note. Thank you very much, Michael. Okay, I think it's time for the Xennial quiz. So, Michael, what was your favorite album of the 90s?
Oh, it actually comes back to a little bit before the 90s, which is U2's The Joshua Tree.
Okay, you're not the first person here on this podcast to mention U2.
It's a very interesting album because it looks at both the real America and the mythic America. And it's one of those kinds of things that it's spanning both the past and the future in a way that only Xennials could love.
Michael, your favorite film of the decade?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm a therapist, so it would have to be Good Will Hunting, right? Because Robin Williams' performance in that was amazing, and Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, and again, I think what they showcase in terms of that vulnerability and that really digging in is exactly what I think highlights the Xennial generation.
Michael, your favorite gadget of the 1990s?
Oh, this has been interesting because I was thinking about that. And, I thought, well, the Nintendo is a fun gadget, but I still go back to the retro old school. They have the old Atari joysticks that you can buy now, and you have all these different Atari games. And to me, it's like seeing the best of what digital was starting with, but it's so simple, it's almost analog.
I remember that Atari. I had one too. It was incredible at the time when we came across that technology. Now, your favorite book of the 90s, and I'm very much aware that I'm opening Pandora's box here because you are a psychologist, so I bet you've read many, many of them.
Yeah, I couldn't think of anything. Because I was thinking of something. So I'm a reader of the classics. So I love reading the classics, and I was thinking of books that I read, and I'm thinking that's what made me think of Oprah's book club because some of the books that she had, like Edwidge Danticat, for example, is a good example of an author who wrote some really beautiful books. And I think the fact that you had a book that speaks such a deep fictional level, but gets at like the real non-fictional truth, I think to me, those are the books that really spoke to me in the 90s.
Michael, one word to describe the decade, the 1990s.
This is like this was the hardest question, which I have no answer to other than whoa. I mean, I think there's so much between the movement from the analog to the digital, the movement into grunge. There was so much shifting, and I think it was just like if you think of this shift from the analog to the digital world, it's like hang on.
A big shift indeed. And last but not least, one word to describe Xennials.
Ooh, this is interesting. That's good. Now, I didn't prep this one, so let's see. What's a good word to describe Xennials? I think there's the word that comes to mind for me is fluid.
I like that very much.
But the ironic thing is they're fluid, but they have form. And I think that's the great strength of Xennials is that they are able to be flexible and move into a lot of different territories and a lot of different aspects, but they're also solid.
Michael, thank you so much for your great contribution to the Xennial podcast. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Charlotte. This was fun.
Absolute pleasure. That was Michael Alcee, clinical psychologist in New York.